as in Europe, artistic practice in dance, social developments and requirements towards students and their education had changed over the years. The discussion on reforming dance training in Germany is apparent, I would say, from the 90s on, and a lot of those reasons we also have discussed already this morning. I guess it is not only related to shifts in artistic process and social or aesthetic output, but maybe also the role models of training, especially in the contemporary dance sector, got, I would say, maybe outdated in the way they are institutionalized and practiced. Today the diversity of techniques and trainings make clear understandings and relational perspectives more and more difficult. This is specifically the case as knowledge in dance is still mainly communicated orally through bodies, from teachers to students, from peers to peers, and so on, the relations we could discuss. The way in which dance technique is taught and passed on is influenced by personal background, as we had today also in the class, this wonderful relation to evolving cultural situations, which was just discussed now before this, as well as by a crossover and fusion of material and methods. Out of this context, I would like to give an insight into Dance Techniques 2010, Tanzplan Germany, how we relate to dance knowledge in the field of practice. And beyond that, on current discourses around what technique is or could be in a subject area which is constantly reflecting and analyzing its own references and setups. So the questions which, from my understanding, are still relevant since the publication appeared, or maybe even more now, are how do we define the term contemporary as well as the term technique, as they are both relevant within this research project and even in the title of it, specifically in relation to current context of hybridized physical practices and a demand to look at practice beyond a Western canon as a main reference system. I would like to quote the German scholar Professor Dr. Gerald Siegmund here, who framed this context in the following way. Any technique of dance is both a body memory, a kind of storage, and a form of access to the body, an activity. This also implies that it is a kind of knowledge specific to the body that dances, as it must relate to space and time as well as to other dancers in space. The body that dances turns into an archive of experiences, coded in movements and steps. This knowledge is passed on orally in the form of instructions and physically through imitation. It is also recorded in writings through handbooks, as well as pictorially in the form of photographs, videos, or diagrams. Its knowledge, moreover, is the knowledge of cultural situations and the discourses in which it has developed. The body is a contemporary historical formation in dance. It is possible to follow the traces of its history, its narratives, the connected emotions. End of quote. I think this analysis frames the research and probably its limitations, from my understanding, quite well, and opens up a wider perspective on questions around skill, technique, maybe even craftsmanship, and so on, which most of the times are already inscribed in physicality, as well as into the methodologies and practices of techniques. The mentioned diversity and hybridity of dance training today is quite challenging, not only for educational institutions, but also in relation to the specificity of artistic process and a general decision why and how certain practices are institutionalized. There is not such thing as a set technique. There's only personal relations to it. And if we acknowledge that, that maybe is opening also another way on how we could relate to knowledge in the field. So following these arguments, it is important to me that the perspective on this research project is strongly rooted also in my biography into dance as having been a dancer, or being a dancer, whatever, however one would call it, and also the needs from the field for contemporary dance. The starting aim was to produce working materials about dance techniques. In German we would say an Arbeitsbuch. One could translate it with a practical handbook or workbook, or even reference book, something really to use into practice. In order to achieve this, we asked ourselves, how could we bring artists' and educators' practice together with theoretical approaches taken by dance scholars to learn from each other and match or integrate or bridge diverse experiences. So it was really about dialogue and a practice of reflection. Different experts from dance practice, theoreticians were equally involved in the research teams right from the beginning. So we were trying to overcome this hierarchy of where really is the knowledge. Our goal was to learn more about the histories, the context, teaching methods, principles behind individual practitioners in relation to a certain practice within and outside the studio. Since there has been no comparative study examining practices employed by contemporary and modern dance educators at the time, our ultimate goal was to make this knowledge available and at the same time highlight individual experiences and perspectives arising out of deep physical biographies in practice. In order to do so and to frame the process, we started with an extensive literature research, not just to find out what kind of materials are there, but also to look at the way on how dance knowledge in training is translated into other media, such as text or other forms of descriptions, which already shows it is about a translational process. On the other hand, once the publication was there, is the question, how do we retranslate? Because that is nothing if we don't start to work and find, again, new forms of interpretation of that information. Different dance departments in Germany and England, Austria, who got involved and were able to invite and work with a renowned dance educator who was thematically interesting for them. So it was immediately a question how these individuals would relate to the curriculum and the idea of profile within the institution. Decisions then were made in conclusion with us, taking the artistic profile of the respective location, university into account. Before I give a short insight into the organizational structure within the project, it seems important to mention that it was never intended that this project provides a comprehensive survey of dance techniques or teaching models, nor was it intended to be conclusive. This is very important to me on the selection of the teachers as well as the general limitations caused by the decisions by the decisions we made with that documentation. One could say these are only 7 examples, and I think we need much more of that. We were focusing strongly on the individuality of the teachers and the research teams on one hand, and at the same time developing a structure and framing which allows the user to put the different approaches in relation to each other. I would like to take into further consideration that 2 of the experts whose working methods had been researched in the project died after finishing the research in 2011. They are, and one of them I'm sure a lot of people here in the space are familiar with, Jill Clark with the research on minding motion at Laban, and then Alan Danielson on Humphrey Limon tradition at the Paluca University in Dresden. He was the director of the Limon Institute in New York at the time. So these deep biographies into dance and great resources for practitioners and education would partially be lost without the materials of this publication. the research teams of the 7 projects up, there is a whole process of side articles, of translating the all written material into English language, which was another process of translating and bridging information and trying even deeper to understand the outcomes of the different researches. What is important to me and what came up in some of the discussions here, something which I really learned from the publication and which is very important to me when I work with my students, is this whole ideologic discourse we have in the field. Ballet bad, contemporary good, explorative good, set material bad. It is a subtext which is constantly communicated, and for me it is much more a question. It's not about aesthetics, it's not about set material, not set material. For me it's about information. So if I look at it from the perspective of information, then it is not important how historical or actual a practice is. If I like it or if I don't like it, it's the question on how do I translate. And that is really something which is visible here in the categories. We had more than 80 research questions, which all of the teams had to answer. There was no way out. And this is the structure also of the publication. So you always find the titles and then you find the questions under. So you can look at the publication from that side. We had 4 categories: historical concept, and now I come to the point which I just had before, concept and ideology, which is always communicated together with movement and physicality. In dance, this goes together. And this is actually quite a vulnerable space, I would say. And then we have all questions on methodology and transmission here. Yeah? So just these are the categories under which we entered. From my understanding, the problem in dance is that this hybridity we talk about, when we are not daring to specify what are the ingredients of that. And the ingredients of that for me is the interesting point to kick off from, and that I find very inspiring and rich, and there's a huge potential also to actually not come to a point which in the 2000s in Germany was a large discussion. Yeah, I developed a training which is very natural, healthy, and it works for any kind of practice. How terrible is that? As for me, that is not in relation to arts, because language in arts is always in relation to specificity, and that's where it gets exciting and interesting. So the question is, how do we get to these points? Because they are there.